Now, of course, this looks fairly innocuous. At this stage of development, we have this ivy climbing up the trunk of this oak. This is Quercus chrysolepis, the so-called canyon oak, a native oak to California. We have ivy growing up the trunk. You can see how it is colonizing this tree like a trellis. It's climbing up the main stems, and now it's about 8 or 10 feet up the trunk. Not a big problem yet, but if this was allowed to run, this would be a very, very serious issue for this tree. What we find is the ivy will go all the way up the main stem, out the lateral limbs, all the way to the tips of the lateral limbs, and cast a shadow on our important structural canopy. We can't let this ivy run. So we're going to remove this. We're not going to let this rise any higher in the tree. Easy to deal with now, but later it becomes a big problem. Many times, if you're careful, you can actually pull back from the trunk and take it there almost all the way up. This should last for a good year or so without any attention, but we have to keep a weather eye on this because it is a huge threat to trees. Some trees are more vulnerable than others. We're going to look at a deodar cedar and show you what's happened there. A much more vulnerable tree to ivy colonization. Here we see a specimen deodar cedar that shows advanced ivy infestation. It took a long time for that amount of ivy to develop in the tree. Perhaps even a decade or two is possible. And that kind of a pest will persist in a tree until it finally overwhelms it. The ivy stalks have become thick enough and strong enough that they're self-supporting. Then they become very much tree-like in their form. They can cantilever out, they can mound up, they can expand in thickness and in density, and we can see that the ivy has expanded out several feet on either side of the trunk. The ivy will climb all the way to the top of the tree and all the way out to the tips of the lateral limbs and shade the tree out from light. The light, of course, is the source of the tree's energy. The tree will withdraw energy from any structures that aren't receiving sufficient light. So ivy is a very, very serious threat. We wouldn't want to let this run any farther, and our recommendation is to remove the ivy. And of course, when the ivy is removed, we don't use the trunk as a chopping block for the machete to chop it out of the tree. That's more bark damage. So it actually has to be pried loose and pulled down. That's the correct way to do it. When you pull those old ivy stalks off the trunk of a deodar, what you find is that root tendrils have actually penetrated into the bark of the tree. I believe they actually wick away a certain amount of the tree's life force. As soon as you cut those stalks from the trunk, try to pull it all down while it's still green. Once it dies, it becomes brittle and it just snaps off, and you don't end up pulling it all out of the tree, and you end up having to climb for it. We want to keep our vines under control. If you do have vines, try to train them onto mechanical trellises that you can then control with. Don't let the trees be the trellises for your vines.